Thank you, everyone, for coming. This is quite a crowd. Did not expect so many of you all to show up. So thank you for being here for the inaugural Linear Magazine event. Here with my friend Cobell Hill. So I'm Justin Potts. I'm the founder of Linear Magazine, which is a publication for the architecturally curious. My aim is to bridge the gap between architects and enthusiasts, provide something more educational than you might get with mainstream publications, but do trendy and fun things like this. And I'm super excited to kick off our event series where we're going to be doing interviews with authors, designers, architects, house tours, and house parties. And super excited to be doing our first event here with Cobell Hill. Cobell Hill is an urban planner, a real estate developer, an optimist, and a new author of Building Optimism, which just came out a couple weeks ago. Yeah, thanks for being.
Justin, thanks so much for having me. It's really exciting to be here with you, to be in this space. I just moved to Brooklyn, so this is a hometown event. And so thank you guys for being here with me tonight.
Yeah, so I first found out about Cobell on Twitter, like I'm sure many of you did. Cobell's amassed quite an audience, about like 60,000 people now follow you and your tweets about urbanism. In the intro of your book, you kind of talk about these grand rules that you set out for yourself, and you committed to this year of like building optimism. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I was mentioning to some people tonight that this wasn't an intentional project. It was super organic. There wasn't really much positive spirit online with respects to new development. Developers get a really bad rap. It's one of the bad D words that you can't talk about online, especially in certain circles. And so I wanted to show people that, not all developers are fat cats wearing suits with the bulldozers coming to, it's coming. To go? All right. Yeah, not a fan of developers. Coming to knock down the school or the local bakery or whatever cherished institution there might be. And I saw one half of the audience talking about pretty buildings in the abstract of, look at this wonderful classical or traditional structure. How we used to do things, sort of a forlorn longing. And the other half saying, in real estate circles, on the development side, very transactionally. I built this building for $300 per square foot. I rented it up. I sold it for $400 a square foot. Look how much money I made, and sort of giving credence to a lot of the stereotypes that we had. And so I wanted to bridge those two worlds and show people that, yes, you have to understand the financials of development, but you could also do things wonderfully. And there are people all over the country who are doing that. So started with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then ultimately I said, I wonder if I can get to a month. I got to 30 days and said, okay, I think I can do 60. And I said, well, why not try to make it a year? That's sort of a nice round number. And it was very difficult. I spent a lot of hours on Pinterest and Google Images and Twitter and Facebook and whatever, social media platform people were posting architecture to. But ultimately, I came away really inspired, as I hope many of you in this room are, that, it might seem difficult to find at first, but there are practitioners who are doing extraordinary work all over the country, in very small towns and big cities and everywhere in between.
So let's talk about some of that extraordinary work. We both live in Brooklyn. I think Brooklyn is one of the kind of pinnacles of walkable communities, Brooklyn Heights, Fort Greene. Where are some other places in the city that you think are inspiring places for the future?
So we can keep talking about Brooklyn. There are a couple of projects in the book that focus on it. There's sort of, I look back in the first half of the book to a lot of development in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And that's not just to have some sort of nostalgia for better days past. I think it can represent a model for the future. So one project that I mentioned in Brooklyn is this place called Warren Place Muse. Is anybody in here familiar with it? No? Great. All right. So I'm going to proselytize a little bit. And then you guys can all go look up on Google afterwards or take a trip to Cobell Hill. So it was this project developed by a social reformer named Alfred Trebly White. He was a Dutch merchant turned philanthropist who, not dissimilar to today, saw the conditions that many of his fellow New Yorkers were facing and wanted to do something about it. But he didn't have avarice in his heart. He wanted to create a sort of enduring and they wouldn't have called it affordable then, but today we would know this as like an affordable housing project for the working classes. And so that's just what he did. These were a collection of cottages that are rather narrow. They're 13 and a half feet wide, 30 feet deep, 3 stories, 1,000 square feet. And so long as one was working or holding a steady job, they were given access to these homes, and they were reserved for families. The philosophy behind it was that families in the late 19th century didn't have much access to open space. Kids were often running in traffic. It's a very different sort of traffic than today. Trains running through the middle of streets, as opposed to just some guy running a red light. There was a real need for this more enlightened form of housing, we'll say. And so it was broadly successful. It endures to today. And so that's one measure of success. The other is that what was once affordable housing is now very expensive. And these small working class cottages now cost around $2 million. That may not be the most optimistic, from our very transactional developers. Maybe yes, that's a great sign. But I actually think it's proof that there's this model that worked so well that it's now fought over by all but the wealthiest people who can afford that. So that's one example from 130 years ago that in some of our work, which maybe we'll talk about later, we're trying to emulate in other parts of the state. Then today, they're sort of the other end of the spectrum, which maybe I'll reference, but we won't touch on as much because it's sort of obvious in some ways. How many people know the High Line? This one should be, yep, there we go. And some people here, live off of the High Line, and I'm very fortunate to be able to do so, and let me sleep on their couch when I'm over there. There's one project called the Fitzroy. Anyone familiar with that? Mm-hmm. It is sort of clad in green terracotta. It is exquisite.
This one gets tweeted all the time.
This one does get tweeted. If you ever want to go viral, it's very good. I'll retweet you. And it sort of harkens back to the same era, a century ago. It's vaguely Art Deco. And those condos sell for $3,000 a square foot. So, a modest one bedroom might cost you $1 million. That again is very expensive, but I think it's a testament to the fact that people want to pay for quality. They also in New York have to pay for high land prices. But for those developers, architects, planners who are looking for evidence that a more optimistic worldview can readily be applied, just look at the market. It's demanding these sorts of places. And hopefully some public officials that we may or may not be talking to will take this up in some of their plans, in either this administration or the next. But I think there's a groundswell of support for it.
It seems a bit impossible to think about. You want something nice, you want something walkable, you want to be in a 15-minute city, and it also needs to be affordable. I'm curious, and I'm sure other people are curious here, why is this so difficult to do?
Oh, man. We're only here for 45 minutes. So you read the book, and then maybe after that, there'll be a sequel that comes out a little bit more. The long story short is that, I don't know how best to attack it, is that at every path, or rather every decision that we've made in city building, we've layered one or two regulation. This is not, by the way, I'll preface this, call for deregulation's sake. A lot of laws that we have in our cities are well-intentioned. And at their genesis, they made a lot of sense. But over years and then decades and then centuries, when those laws stack on top of each other, it's very common that they can lose their original purpose, let's say. So I reference this in the book. It sort of becomes a palimpsest where you have this document that you scroll off, you write some more rules on, you scroll off again, you write on top, on top, on top. And suddenly you might be contradicting yourself 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 ways. I will certainly spare from the urban planning perspective, what exactly those rules may be. But the long story short is that we have tried to codify our way into a better world. And a lot of the built examples of the last century show that that's not necessarily the best way to go forward.
So there are some cities that are fighting this deregulation, and there are other cities that are doing a pretty good job comparably. Austin comes to mind with their reduced parking minimums, their reduced minimum lot sizes. What are they doing right, and what are some other cities that we can look to as examples?
Yeah, so Austin, perhaps famously in the last year, has been making the waves that their rents have gone down by 15, 16% year over year. Which is a sort of funny thing for a developer to be cheering on, but it's sort of a proof that when you build a lot of housing, which is what they did over the last 2 or 3 years post-pandemic, rents go down, funnily enough, because supply is able to meet demand. This is not an experiment that we have run in New York, though I think we're a fertile laboratory for it. So hopefully we can do that soon. And how did they exactly do this? They streamlined permitting. So instead of waiting for several years from reviewers, you can get back an answer in a couple of months. I'll just draw a really quick dichotomy here. We develop buildings in Southern California and in New York. We have a couple of projects just north of the city. In California, they've streamlined permits, and it takes us about 18 months to get an approval. In parts of Texas, it could be 3 days, where you just walk into City Hall and they say, this looks good. Okay, meets all these requirements. We're going to move forward. So that's one thing. But again, deregulation for deregulation's sake doesn't really mean much unless there's a certain level of thoughtfulness to that. So they have repealed parking minimums in Austin, I believe, has, but cities around the country certainly have, so that if you're building a 3-unit apartment building, you don't have to provide 2 parking spaces. Those 6 spaces might take up a quarter of a lot, and then it becomes very difficult to build otherwise. Some cities have abolished single-family zoning, and so that doesn't mean that single-family homes are illegal. It means that you can build other things. Other things just become legal. And so Austin, I believe, allows triplexes on most lots throughout the city. Minneapolis allows quadplexes. We can go further and further into the nuances here. But yeah, you open up the code book and you pretty much flip to one of 1,100 pages and put your finger down and you can find something to reform.
So interested in kind of the community pushback here. Austin was also notorious for this. My parents live in Austin, so I spend a lot of time thinking about this when I go there, and it's funny just how different it is from Brooklyn in terms of density. But there are a lot of people in Austin and elsewhere that don't want their cities to look like New York, and I think you use this term like urban canyon, concrete jungle. Do you think that's a valid concern?
Absolutely. New York is rightfully known as the concrete jungle, and I understand why people don't want to live here. It's great, but I think even those of us who love it understand its faults. Something that I'm very careful to protect against in this book is to apply a one-size-fits-all solution and say that Austin should be the same as Seattle, should be the same as Memphis. Vernacular and tradition really matters in different places, and Manhattan wouldn't be so special if everywhere else looked like it. But just because you allow a greater level of density doesn't mean you're going to become Manhattan. There's, in New York City, there's 8.5 million people. In Manhattan, there's 1.7 million, I believe. That many people are not going to be living in apartments in Austin. So it sort of becomes this big, scary bogeyman, which, it's very easy to curry opposition if you just say, do some doodles of towers with angry eyes, on signs. And I've seen many of those across the country. So I think the concerns are well merited, but not well placed. I understand why people don't want their communities to change, but they also won't change in those ways.
Yeah, I mean, I always see the comparison to like Paris, for example. And you can show like the quiet street in Paris that everyone thinks of as the ideal. And that's, an exponential amount of density compared to suburbia. Yet it doesn't feel like it.
So I don't know if you're teeing me up for this one, but I just wrote an article on the density of Paris versus Manhattan. And sort of controversially, we'll see how it goes, for a journal, the Council on Tall Buildings and Urban Habitats, that love their towers. I love towers too, but I basically wrote this and say, hey, towers aren't all that. Sustainability means going beyond just 50-story buildings for a number of reasons. It's very expensive to build that tall, the level of energy required, and so on and so on. Paris, 7-story city, it's a city of romance, city of lights. I think people would be surprised to learn that the average density of the city is higher than New York City. It's not higher than Manhattan, but the average density of Paris is about 21,000 people per kilometer, which makes it amongst the 20 densest places on Earth. And if you take Le Marais is a little less dense, but if you take somewhere like Montmartre, which is where Sacré-Cœur is, beautiful tourist venue, that has, I think, the highest density of any jurisdiction in the Western world, and comparable to places like Manila and Jakarta and Tokyo. It does not look like that. And so there's ways to achieve high density in really beautiful and wonderful ways.
So Linear is obviously part, an urbanism publication, but it's also a design publication mostly. And I'm curious, what your thoughts are on local vernacular and how opinionated should we be on, maintaining a region's character?
Not very, I think is the quick answer. But the longer one to dissect there is that what we hold as cherished vernaculars today, or cherished local traditions, one day were the new and innovative styles of their day. So people will probably look with a great degree of affection and fondness towards San Francisco's Victorians, for example. These are very cheap buildings. They were thrown up after the earthquake, and now they endure, partly out of some affection for them, but really because you can't build anything else in San Francisco. And so what were once worker housing, now $6 million homes in some cases. Our cities are at their best when we let them decide what they want to be. And there are certain curves and contours that they want to take. And we should embrace that. And it may sometimes lead to some outcomes that aren't wholly desirable, but cities are not immutable. And if we build a bad building, we can take it down just as easily. It seems, verboten in today's world to say, let's take something down. What are the embodied carbon consequences? It's very wasteful, of course. But we need to move away, I think, from this sacred notion that our cities should never change, because it's fundamentally ahistoric. Our cities are always changing, from a community composition perspective, an aesthetic perspective, businesses, economic development, so on and so on. And I think we'll be surprised in good ways at which way they turn.
What do you think the city of the future looks like? And is it the same throughout all of these cities? Do they have common characteristics? And I asked this because I thought, one of the interesting parts of the book was going through kind of these different design philosophies throughout, the past hundreds of years, and how these design philosophies have impacted the way our cities are built. Do you feel like you have a particular design philosophy, or are you just in favor of building?
Yes, let's build. I think the city of the future looks like the city of the past. There are all these fantastic, really, visions of what it could be, of flying cars and glass skyscrapers. And, for those of you who are familiar with Google's Sidewalk Lab project in Toronto a few years ago, there are these grand visions for what it can be. And almost all of them have failed, even those that have been built. You can think of Neom in Saudi Arabia. There's some portions have been built. Dubai, of course, is the best example, because they're fundamentally not about building around people. There is a sense of scale and awe associated with them. And, you can have that, but it has to be in its right dose. Most of the city is should be compositionally how we built in the early 20th century, in the 18th century, the 16th century, and let the style change and evolve. And the stores on the ground floor are going to be different. The people who are living upstairs are going to be different as well. And, the textures will be, but the basic fabric shouldn't change. There are certain things that we've gotten right over tens of thousands of years of human development. And I think we forget that our communities are a habitat that we've evolved with, and shirking that evolution, I think, is why people feel so cold and lonely and small when they're in places that, like a Dubai, for example, or like certain excesses of the modernist movement, like Boston City Hall, for example. I know it has its fans, but as far as I'm concerned, it'd be better if it was a little bit more human oriented.
So, cities feel crowded today. Some of them, you take the train and you're at it's rush hour and it's standing room only. And what comes first in building these cities? I think some people have this argument that we can't build more housing because we don't have room for them in other ways. Do you just do it all at once? Do you just see which one you can do first? What's the process to improving these?
Yeah, it's sort of the cart or the horse. A lot of American cities developed along railroad lines or riverfronts or ports, and there were large capital improvements infrastructure that was developed. It's very difficult to do that today. One of the arguments in the book is that we sort of need to take that control back. The most infamous example is California's high-speed rail project, for those maybe familiar, where the estimates are that it's going to cost north of $120 billion. And they've only built a couple of miles of track from Bakersfield to Fresno, in two cities that are great cities, but not exactly our highest connectivity, right? And so the reason why it's so expensive, it sort of gets back to the regulation question, where there's 20 different environmental review statements that we need to carry out. We need to get the permission of every landowner who is within a half mile of the pathway. And we need to, in some cases, pay top dollar for land that the path might be in front of. And this is probably, will certainly get me in trouble. I think we need to use eminent domain in some of these cases if we want to be able to facilitate the needs of people more broadly. The state has to come in and say, "We're sorry, we're going to compensate you for fair and just compensation, but we have a public need that supersedes this localized private need." So that's sort of the macro answer. But then scaling back to get to the thrust of your question, I think most of the development in the city has to be incremental. There are examples of top-down development. Certainly in the U.S., we can look around the world too. Brasilia is well, to me, I don't think it's the best model of building, but it's very top-down. It was built all at once to one style, and now the city can't really evolve. All of the life in Brasilia occurs just outside of the city core, in sort of the slums that are remarkably vibrant and built in incremental accordance to the people's needs. There's very little going on in Brasilia itself, and that's because even if you are the most brilliant thinker on cities since Da Vinci, you can't anticipate every individual outcome that might happen, and so you sort of have to let people do what they're going to do within certain guidelines, of course. We can't have people building homes in the middle of streets that are, built of styrofoam and they're just going to fall down. So we need some level of regulation and planning from a top down. But most of that growth should be happening bottom up.
Let's talk about courtyards. This I feel like always comes up on Twitter, and I feel like whenever someone thinks of kind of their ideal urban dwelling, it's a cute kind of 7-story building with some courtyards. And we talked about one in Upper Manhattan that really resonated with you.
Yeah, there's a number in across New York City. Is which one in Upper Manhattan? Just refresh.
I don't remember.
It's a number that we could. So I'll talk to some Upper Manhattan examples and hope that's one that you'll hit it. So there are sort of these very extravagant, and I'll mention this briefly because I don't want to be talking too much about very expensive housing, because that's not what I'm personally focused on, and I don't think that's what would be most applicable to people here and broadly. But these grand apartment buildings, the Apthorpe, the Bell Nord, are oriented around courtyards, and the brilliance of the courtyard as a form is that you're able to get light into two sides. And that sounds simple, but it really isn't. For anyone who's lived in an old tenement in New York City, how precarious it can be. I personally lived in apartments where my only light source was a very small window into a trash courtyard, and I didn't get light in even at high noon. So the ability to get light from both sides allows you to double the unit mix, bringing more light and air. These things were very important in the early 20th century. The example that I'll bring here in New York is in Jackson Heights, if anyone in here has been or familiar. The food's amazing. The culture's great. Definitely go out there on the 7 train. It's a lot of fun for a day. And if you have time after you eat your samosas and jalebi and maybe a mango lassi or two, there are some in this room who are noted fans of that. Take a walk a couple of blocks north of Roosevelt Avenue, and you'll see these really handsome structures that are all 5 to 7 stories. And you'll notice that there are little passageways every 30 or 40 feet. And you can poke your head in through the gates, and if anybody asks you what you're doing, just say you're an architect. Even though I'm not an architect, I use that excuse whenever I'm looking at a building, and it really quickly disabuse anyone of suspicion. So say you're an architect, you're looking at courtyards, and you'll notice that even though the buildings are built right up to the street front, tall, there's trees, so that takes away the impact of that density. There is actually quite an extraordinary amount of open space that you wouldn't expect to see in a dense area such as this. So I think there's been a resurgence of this advocacy for courtyard housing, different than the form of 501s that we've been seeing proliferate in the Sun Belt and in the West Coast, because they sort of give you the best of both worlds. They give you high density without a trade-off of public space or quasi-private space.
Yeah, it feels like we have a bunch of those 5/1s that are labeled as luxury apartments, and the door handles fall off when you get in there.
Yeah.
So we can't all build courtyards in our homes, unfortunately. But what are some things that people can do in their own homes or their own communities to make them feel more sustainable and optimistic and welcoming?
So I promise I'm not getting paid by big trees to say this, but plant a tree is probably the best thing that anyone can do in their community. It'd be great if every time I said plant a tree, I got paid a little bit for that. But that's the number one thing you can do. You can coordinate with your city to have someone come out. In Philadelphia, they actually have just passed a law where if you call the city, you can coordinate somebody coming out to the site. I don't even know if there's a fee. It might be nominal for them to plant a tree right in front of your home. And the benefits of street trees are really extraordinary. They provide shade, which is important in a lot of neighborhoods that experience what's known as the urban heat island effect. What is the urban heat island effect? So people that don't know. So this is this theory that not a theory, it's proven. Imagine you're walking around a heavily asphalted area, a lot of parking lots, wide roads in the middle of summer. It's going to be pretty hot, right? And empirically, it's much hotter than the surrounding countryside. So they'll take these analyses, or they'll conduct a series of analyses, take data from the city to the countryside. What we found is that on a hot July day, it can be upwards of 20 degrees warmer on an unshaded street with some empty parking lots as opposed to the countryside. This has significant health impacts and consequences. But if we're not only thinking about our health, which we always should be, it's important. Street trees are beautiful. If you find yourself wandering around the city, you're probably going to be drawn to the places that are more leafy and green, as opposed to those harsh and barren blocks. That's probably the lowest level down. But even if someone's not going to come out and plant the tree in front of your house, you can talk to your city council member. You can talk to a local official and say, I want to build, or I would like my mom or my daughter or a family member to be able to live closer to me, but it's really expensive. Is there any way that we could pass a law so that we can allow for a duplex or an ADU in the back of our yard, or any of these things? That's a very low touch way to improve your community. And of course, we can scale up all the way to courtyard housing and beyond.
So I'd love to open this up to some questions from the audience. And can I hear from you what you'd like to learn from Gobi?
Hi, Bobby. My name's Mike. I feel like there is a very large disconnect between the public that rents apartments to live in and lives in the city and contributes to society, and the private development community. The private development community, I have a little bit of experience with this. I've been in real estate for years, so I have a little bit of experience with this. They have serious costs that they need to solve for in order to develop housing. The public, people that are in society, don't understand how much stuff costs, don't understand the laws and zoning regulations and red tape that developers have to jump over or cut or whatever to get past. What do we do, practically speaking? How do we shorten the gap between people screaming at the big guys that are trying to evict me and charge up my rent and making shitty big multifamily buildings that have thin walls and are crappy to live inside of? Yeah. And the realities of the situation. How do we bring the two worlds closer together? They don't want to talk.
They don't want to talk. And I think the first thing is to get them to try to talk. There's a couple of projects that I've been in the middle of in the city and more further afield, where I raise my hand and say, if you need someone to play the role of big bad developer, I'll be that, because I'm on your side. I want to deliver affordable housing for people in the community who are making 60% of the prevailing income, who might not be provided for in traditional market rate. And I think there has to be an openness on both sides to want to come to the table. And so what I've done is say, hey, look, if you think that big bad developer is pulling the wool over your eyes and they're making obscene amounts of money, how about we look at the financial model together and let's see how much they're making. And let's ask them some key questions together. What are your costs? How high are the taxes here? How much you're paying your architects, so on and so forth. And we can get to the bottom of it and know if they really are doing that. And what I found is when you have that exercise with the community and say, look, here's how much money they're making. And traditionally, this is a little stat that people can take away. In market rate apartment development, so a lot of those 501s that are very shoddily built, your margins are very, very, very slim. They're about 3%, 3 to 4%. Before you get to debt service, so before your mortgage. That seems crazy. How can that be possible? These are $100 million buildings. What's going on here? All these buildings trade at something called a cap rate, capitalization rate. And in places like New York, it's tied closely to interest rates. We don't have to get too into that. They're around 4.5% to 5%. New buildings trade for lower caps. And the reason, they're so low is that apartment buildings are durable vehicles for returns. And so people are willing to accept a lower return that has sort of over 20 or 30 years. And I read about this in the book, compress cap rates down. So you show them the numbers and you say, look, here's what we're making. Everyone's got to make a little bit of money. I think that conversation has actually shifted in the last couple of years. I was just up in a fairly progressive city that historically would have been anti-development. And someone said to me, no, I know a developer has to make a profit, but And that just was not happening a decade ago. So now people are saying, I understand the costs, and we just need to keep having these conversations. A part of that conversation, I think that's important, is to say, especially you have to tailor this conversation differently depending what place you're in. If you're in the South in a more conservative city, you might say this is about growth and economic development. In a more progressive city, you say the people who are building this structure are all working class. The roofer, the plumber, the framer, these are not bigwigs, and they're making 80% of the money on this project. Don't you want to support good paying jobs for the working class, who, by the way, are predominantly immigrants in the trades? These are things that we should be encouraging. This is the American dream made manifest. Unfortunately, it happens one conversation at a time, and then they percolate. But those conversations are happening, and I think these are opportunities like tonight to have them and disseminate it.
Hi, Obi. And Zach. I was going to ask you a little bit about just what you're doing in your day job at Backyard. How do you see the zoning for ADUs evolving, whether that's just domestically or internationally? Where is it at going?
Thanks, Zach. So I think it's sort of a fait accompli that every city and town in the country will adopt more progressive ADU. Show of hands also before we throw around all this. People know what ADUs are in here? For those of who don't, they're just a little granny cottage in your backyard or an apartment above the garage sort of thing. So the cities that have passed these common sense ADU laws have seen the rents go down. Which is very important, as we mentioned earlier in the conversation. They've also seen greater rates of family connectivity, which I think is very important. There's also this like fledgling vernacular around them. You're getting really quirky and idiosyncratic things being built, because if it's only an $80,000 structure in the back of your house, you can do some weird stuff with it as opposed to a $2 million building. So I think that's really cool. The way they've sort of shifted over the last decade or two is that they went from being very prescriptive. It has to be 1,200 square feet. You have to have 2 car spots or parking spaces. The person who builds it has to be the homeowner. These are very, unfortunately, burdensome, and it led to very few ADUs actually getting built. And the states that have seen the most accessory dwelling unit construction, like California, from, I believe, 1985 under Governor Brown to today, they've progressively taken off these regulations, and now we've seen a veritable boom in the last 5 years. The great thing about that, it's bad for California, it took 40 years, but the great thing is that Alabama, as they craft their legislation, doesn't need to go through the 4-decade process. They just copy and paste, and we're seeing that. And so I think the argument is very common sense to make. Why don't you want someone's mother-in-law to be able to live in their backyard? There are less and less good answers why that shouldn't be the case. And so I think we're going to see, by the end of the decade, a plurality, if not a majority, of municipalities allowing these things that were once ubiquitous, once again, rise.
I'm Raymond. So I just got to the chapter where you very clearly outline why a lot of cities look the same. Big developers get so many contracts because they can rinse and repeat, saying huge multi-million-dollar buildings that are perfect for institutional investors, essentially. For anyone who on there.
Spoiling alert.
Well, I want it. And so perhaps you answer this question like in the second half of the book. I just haven't gotten to yet, but I guess for a spoiler, how do we get some more of these smaller developers to get more interesting projects built? How it doesn't seem realistic unless you know otherwise, like to access those huger pools of capital that are so risk averse. If that's not realistic, what are some, what's one perhaps clever way that we can try to get more beautiful and optimistic buildings built?
It's a fantastic question, and again, I didn't plant this question, but it's sort of it's the question that I'm trying to solve now, and that I think is becoming. It's not yet being asked in the right places, but it's starting to. the truth is, the spoiler alert is that we can't stop the forces of institutional capital, and we shouldn't entirely want to. These large scale production builders are providing new housing for millions of people, and that's a good thing. The issue is the concentration. They're building too much of the new housing such that everywhere does look the same. So how do we sort of loosen up the regulations to help small developers? There are very prescriptive ways of doing this, where we can say, hey, if you have under 10 employees and less than $10 million in annual billings, we'll give you preference in a permitting environment, which I think is wrong. The easiest way to do it is to just make it easier to build generally. The barriers to entry right now are very high in development. And a lot of zoning codes around the country privilege large-scale development because you can either build a sea of single-family homes in a subdivision, or you can build a 300-unit building. It's not legal in most places, as crazy as it seems, to build a duplex. San Francisco, one of the world's most dynamic cities, fully 74% of its land, 75% of its land is exclusively reserved for single-family homes. And so in that last 25% of the city, the land prices have been pushed up such that it doesn't make economic sense to build anything other than a large tower. And smaller developers can't marshal resources for that. So if this example is in the book, I think it made it in the book. If not, we'll mention it here. If you just took 10% of San Francisco's single-family zone land, and allowed 10-unit building, so that could be a 3-story building that has 4 units on the first and second, 2 on the third, 5-story building with 2 units on each floor, a lot of different permutations. Just 10% of that land, you would double the city's housing stock, which is a pretty extraordinary thing to think about. And those 10-story buildings are easier for small developers to bite off. But because they can't build them, they can't build a duplex, much less a 10-unit, they're going to get pushed up. So that's one thing that we can do to allow for more smaller lot development. The other thing is a little bit more wonky. It's a federal policy issue. Currently, the FHA, who underwrites all the single-family mortgages and backstops them in America, it's basically why we were able to build our way out of the housing crisis post-Great Depression, post-World War II. They said to the banks, look, I know it's very risky for you to take on the loan of someone who's just buying a new home. Should anything go wrong, we're going to be the lender of last resort. And that gave developers and banks a lot of confidence in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, and they built millions of homes. That product doesn't exist for a duplex or a quadplex. And so if I go to a bank and say, I want to build a 4-unit with a barbershop on the ground floor, they're going to look at me like I'm crazy. 1, because it's probably illegal to do that in the city from a zoning perspective. And 2, because they can't sell that on their books or to somebody else. So they can't offshore their risk. And so until we make it more practicable to build from a land use perspective, and then from a financing perspective, it's going to be very difficult to move beyond that. There are, of course, many dozens of other small little tweaks that we're always going to have to be minding. But I think those are 2 of the biggest ones that we can see more small scale development.
So my question is, you're a developer, you are building buildings at the scale of units that can measure in dozens, right? You have a degree in planning. What you do can seem intimidative. However, I think developer is a very flexible word, and it can be something at your scale, or it could be built just doing something like an ADU in the backyard. And in fact, for those of you following, New York City just legalized ADUs citywide through the city of Yes. And so for everyone here, since you're, I think, all building curious or build curious at the day sits, and, maybe at some point in your careers, you want to escape the email lines and pet the grass and kill something. How do you kind of explain to folks, even at a very small scale, how to, maybe start to develop? And even if it's very one lot, one single family lot, adding you at the back. And where would they get started outside of reading Building Optimism? Where did they get started? Where did they get started? What questions do they ask? Could they network with, et cetera?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it can seem, especially in a place like New York, completely inaccessible, because the smallest buildings here, a single family home in Eastern Queens, could cost you $800,000. That's not easy to get started, versus in Chicago, you might be able to get a townhome for a couple $100,000 and renovate it and with some friends. So capital is a real issue, and I'm very mindful of that. It sounds sort of I don't know, grotesque in some ways to be so focused on money. But simple truth is that buildings aren't going to get built without them. So you have to be considerate of where those costs are coming. My suggestion in New York is maybe the city of yes will help, but the barriers to entry are really high. But there might be another market from your hometown or an hour or so away from here that you could potentially enact some change. The development is a very tricky process because it's not every day is different. It's not like you're planting a garden and you say, well, we're going to get some fertilizer, we're going to get some seeds, and we're just going to put them in there and wait. You're constantly managing a dozen different trades or a dozen different practitioners. So the easiest way to get started might seem counterintuitive. It is just to get started. And that's sort of what we did. I wouldn't recommend it in the markets that we operated in because they were too expensive and too difficult. And so we're waiting 1.5 years for a permit. And adding 2 ADUs is going to cost you $800,000. You got to hustle and shake for investors. There's not going to be salary involved. Don't quit your day job if you want to be a developer. The big developers are making a lot of money. I can assure you the small ones are not. But it is a very iterative process where you can go and try to read as much as you want to read. You will never have 100% information. You have to get to a point where you feel comfortable enough. Certainly reach out to me, reach out to Ian, reach out to someone in your community that you admire who's doing good work and see where that process begins. And then just be comfortable with the fact that this is a long-term project. And if you're betting on a city that you believe in or that you grew up in, you have some level of attachment to, this is going to be a very long-term project. And that's what you should be more focused on. You're not going to retire off of your first ADU. It might retire you, in some meaningful ways. And so I want to be cautious not to discourage people, to this process. I think anyone who wants to be a developer should. We need all talented and thoughtful people, such as are in this room, to go out and change our built environment. But it is something that doesn't have a set playbook, and every city is going to be different. Every circumstance is going to be different. So you just have to get comfortable with the market that you're in, with the plan that you have. Why are you doing this? And then just sort of jump in. And it's a very exciting ride, but it's not a ride that necessarily comes with guardrails even.
What's your take on what's going on in Gowanus with all the developments on the canal?
So I bike past there to go get donuts in Park Slope. So I love it for that reason.
Where do you get donuts in Park Slope?
There's 7th Avenue Diner. It's great. Go early, they sell out. I think it's good. For those who are unfamiliar, Gowanus was a super fun site, a canal 100 years ago or so. All the factories and heavy industry that existed there, I thought it'd be a good idea to just dump their waste into the canal. And I believe it was the most toxic site in America. Is that right?
Pretty close.
Yeah, pretty close to it. And so there's been a decades-long process to remediate it. And now they're building a lot of housing there. And I don't know if your question was pointed, so I'm going to take it as a general question. If it is, there's a follow-up. There's a lot of glassy, large new buildings that are rather expensive. There's a Whole Foods. I think that was one of the first buildings that was actually constructed there. But But this is an area that very little housing existed. It's going to be providing a lot of housing for people who might otherwise be forced to find it somewhere else. And what I mean by that is they're high income earners or they have a lot of assets who are living here. If these homes weren't made available to them, they might move to, let's say, to South Slope or to Sunset Park or to Flatbush, an area of the city that has lower income communities and marginalized communities where it becomes a real competition. And so this gets back to the supply question that we talked about. I won't say that supply in the abstract is good, but in this case, there was very little there. They're remediating a toxic Superfund site. Yeah. There's some good new restaurants. It went from being, not much going on to a great neighborhood. So I think it's a good thing.
Yeah. Well, that's what's so interesting. It's interesting about it is there wasn't really much. It's not displacing a lot of people. And it seems like they really made development easy because there are these big towers going up at every little place. There's density, and yet there's like a lack of soul or something. It's kind of what you said, that the pace of the people there kind of feels very artificial. So I don't know if that will end up being true. You can imagine once people live there, it's vibrant, it's Copenhagen-like canals, but it'll be interesting to experiment that if you do remove regulation, you do allow density. Can you actually develop that quickly, or is it just artificial in the end?
So that's a great follow-up. The problem with neighborhoods that are built from scratch, and this is sort of the, Justin and I were talking about the top-down versus incremental, how should city be built, is that I don't know that they ever feel authentic, whatever authentic means, but they don't have a degree of sincerity or
Sincerity's a good word.
Yeah, or character to them, or no, soul is really the best word for it. So you can go to DC to Shaw, Shaw is great, but by the Navy Yard, by the ballpark there, that's not a great neighborhood, and it never will be. I hate to be so definitive about that, but it's true. But I'm right. Yeah. But I mean, the seaport in Boston is similar to that. These are not places that are capable of being home to the small ceramic studio.
There are debts and their mixed use and their.
And so this is where I sort of I go from being the full-throated optimist and yes, rah rah, to having some caveats, which is why these conversations are great. There are a lot of buzzwords that get bandied about: density, multifamily, mixed use, TOD, transit-oriented development, and these are great. But if the people who are developing these structures or who are designing them aren't from the community, of the community, or considerate of the community, because you can be living in Nashville and designing a great building for Tacoma. But it's just the case that if you're not, if you don't have a vested interest there, you might just copy and paste some of these more institutional buildings, which is entirely rational, by the way. Back to Brendan's question, it's not. This isn't a bad thing in the abstract, and these aren't malicious actors. There are all manner of conspiracy theory that gets thrown around. They're all untrue. These are people that you probably, they're in your soccer league, or they're with picking up their kids from school with your kids. So it's just that the sort of firms that can build very large scale development are not well equipped to build the sort of soulful and idiosyncratic places that our communities need. We are not going to be able to do that everywhere. We sort of have to take our wins where we can. The waterfront in Greenpoint or Williamsburg is a great example. Very expensive land, incredible views. Let's build very densely there. And then in neighborhoods like Rego Park or Bensonhurst, let's make it easy for a small family builder to do 3 units or 4 units, and that's where we'll get our character. But you can't hope for a 50-story building to meet the same needs that a 3-story one will.
Cool. So I know Kobe has, I think we still have some books available for sale over there. We also have tote bags. So if you buy a book, we'll throw in a linear tote bag. I think we still have some of those left as well. But thanks so much for this conversation, and thank you all for coming out.
Thank you for having you.
Buenos dias. stick around for a little bit, grab another drink. We'll be here for another hour.
Yeah, and the one last solicitation I will have for you, read the book. It would mean a lot to me. Ratings on Goodreads and Amazon are worth more than gold. So even if you get 2 pages in, go, wow, those are the best 2 pages I've ever read. Thank you guys. Thank you.